show starts in 1 minute. Good evening, folks, and a hearty welcome to our drive-in theater. We have a wonderful evening's entertainment lined up for you, one that will provide several hours of pleasurable relaxation and diversion for you and your family.
Like 9 out of 10 film stars, Raquel Welch uses Lux Beauty Soap.
Well, no, I like to be a woman and a man to be a man, you know.
We hope you'll make this a weekly visit. You love the tasty array of snacks we have to offer. Bring your friends. There are always wonderful new pictures to see. We hope you have a wonderful time.
Hello all, and welcome back to another episode of the Longhouse, the NPR for the sensible centrist. Ludwig Path, how are you doing?
Yeah, I'm doing fine. So happy to be back and be able to finish the Machiavellian series finally.
Yeah, we had slated that for a couple of weeks ago, but we had to postpone the episode, unfortunately. But we're back, and we're ready to tackle the... Well, it's not the second part. I suppose it's part 5 to 7 or something, or 4 to 7.
Yeah, we've just arbitrarily divided it in two, and there's no like logical, start and end point of these things, but it would be a bit much to do in one stream, I think.
Yes, there is a maybe a bit of a logical break in it. I feel that from parts 4 and on, the focus shifts a bit from. He spends a lot of time laying the groundwork with focusing on Machiavelli himself and sort of the ideas of politics as science, and then he sort of goes away from that and returns again in the last chapters on this, his whole sort of his takes on the current world as he's writing, and then what he'd like to see in the political sciences.
Yes, exactly, and. We are a little bit behind the times. I remember in 2020 there was a point where I was just seeing the Machiavellians everywhere, whether it was on Aaron McIntyre or Academic Agent and so on. And you get like the kind of 12-minute breakdown where, okay, here's like the core points. But there are a lot of interesting stuff like between the lines when you dig a little bit into it, and some things that really are enlightening in terms of fleshing out the ideas that we believe in, and other things that are maybe a little bit counterintuitive to a lot of the stuff that's going on inside of the sensible center, I would say.
Certainly. And it's a great book. Having read something like The Populist Delusion last year, I know I commented on this in our last episode too, but it's a great book to follow that up with, because it feels like one level down and a step to the side, but it deals with the same issues and the same analysis. And it's one of those well-written books that don't waste your time. And a lot of these things, of course, it by its nature, then it cannot, cover everything. But if you don't feel like you have the time to sit down and read the Prince or dive deeply into Spengler, reading books like The Populist Delusion, like the Machiavellians, are great ways of getting sort of a good idea of what this actually is, and it's a great tool to internalize this before going further in your intellectual journey. Otherwise, it's just listening to streams. It's all well and good, but I think eventually it sort of just ends up going in one ear and out the other. And these books are a great sort of shortcut.
Yeah, I agree. I think everybody in this sphere should do some reading. Everybody doesn't have to read everything. There is always this sort of time constraint, but you want to have a more nuanced understanding of politics and of like primary sources and like the actual material. rather than just getting those sort of chewed up and spat out versions that you get on podcasts, even though it's from people who you trust. But I mean, trust but verify, as they say, right? You need people who can think a little bit independently. Like, I mean, for most people, it's just going to be listening.
And it's one of those things
others,
where
but,
you read something like this book here, and you look at the source material, right? The references, and then you could decide for yourself if you want to go deeper into a rabbit hole, right? So,
yeah, exactly. But I think before we start the standard presentation, I mean, we've been a little bit more lax on these, reading the news topics and trying to cover locals on-scene drama and so on.
I mean, I guess lax isn't the word. We've been deliberately working on remaining focused on on the themes or topics that we want to present. But there are sometimes things that pop up that we want to comment on, or that we want to spend a couple of minutes to talk about, just because we feel like it. And this is our show, and we can do what we want.
Yes.
So you brought to me the idea of this the trads versus Bronze Age pervert kind of debate that's been going on. I know that because Twitter has been horribly broken lately. I've been getting front row seats to everything Academic Agent has been doing in this sort of fighting on Twitter, because Twitter likes showing me 7 thread deep replies to his tweets, and then watching and then sending me his response to those to those tweets again, and it's very annoying, but also, of course, informative at times. But it's way more than I signed up for.
What was the reason that Academic Agent only uses quote tweets? He has explained it in the past. I just I don't remember exactly the rationale.
It's simply just to control the message. Honestly, it's like to control the flow of the conversation.
Yeah, I mean, I could see if it has some advantage to how the feed works, but it seems like the feed is changing. Like, even though he's like you said, 7 replies deep,
it's actually quite horrible nowadays.
Yeah, Twitter sucks. Honestly, I got to enjoy. I felt like I was late to the party on this one. It's the story of my life, right? To come late to the party, it's like 1 o'clock or something before everybody leaves.
Yeah.
And the climax with Elon stuff, and now it's just kind of lame and broken. I think a lot of people feel the pain.
Back to what it was. It seems to be it certainly seems to be a software issue that can probably be solved, right, at a certain point.
Yeah, I hope so. I mean, I'm doing a lot of like high effort humor on Twitter, and I'm getting like 2 likes or something. I feel like it's almost completely wasted. But I keep trying.
And then like some random tweet you do gets like 5 times your usual views, but still no engagement. It's very strange. I don't understand it. It's very unpredictable these days, which means that I'm just tweeting less. So,
but I mean, getting onto the topic, there is what Bob Ross, the painter, calls the happy little accidents that happen in the world, and like when we picked the name for this stream as the Longhouse, right? This has nothing to do with like the Bronze Age pervert concept of the Longhouse. I think I
remember us vaguely discussing that, like shortly after we picked the name. Like, is this going to be a problem, right?
Yeah, I didn't listen to BAP at the time, so I had no.
No, someone else brought it to me. And I think we discussed it for like 2 minutes, and we figured that his conception is clearly different from sort of the historical Viking Longhouse moniker thing that we're sort of, it's just a branding, right? It's not supposed to have anything to do with his conception of the North American hunter-gatherer longhouses or something.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not entirely clear on his like the historical reference for his longhouse, or how exactly that happened. But again, it wasn't intended to be a reference to that. But I think even if it is, it still works for us. In my
grug-brained sort of take on it, when I came up with the name, it was simply referencing the historical longhouse as a place of gathering and a place where you could invite in travelers and host them, right? which is something that we aim to do here on the show. And then,
Yeah.
of course, referencing something Nordic.
Exactly.
So it was
The working...
purely sort of a bit of a branding thought. It has nothing to do with BAP's conception of the Longhouse.
No, because the working title was, I think, the Scandinavian Roundtable. And then we said, well, okay, it's cooler with the Longhouse because the Vikings lived in longhouses, but now it's become like this. It's become a pejorative term, and I think it still works to have a stream or a podcast called the Longhouse because it's a funny reference. Yeah, we can just play with this. There's no problem at all. But this does bring us into, I mean, because it seems like this is a term that's been flung around on Twitter a lot, and like the new Twitter wars essentially is it's like the Bapists, the Vitalists against the Trads, who I mean it's a very strange conflict. Like, I mean, like most Twitter stuff, I feel like it's just destroying social capital for lols in a sense. Completely, unproductive, but or I don't know. I mean, do you think there's anything productive that comes out of this? Or maybe we should just explain quickly to the audience who the people who are not on Twitter, what this thing is about. Because I mean, I guess you could.
Sorry, you can go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, if you break the, let's say like the quote unquote right wing sphere that we are into different factions. There's like so many mini factions, but they will, surround themselves with certain people, certain points that they will agree on. But there are splits, of course, that and these splits and these frictions, they always come up. And like the current split now is between the people who. I mean, for me, it seems more like a sort of European versus American thing, but it's not entirely that. It's really more like you have the people who are let's say the traditionalists who are into, let's say, large families, religious fundamentalism, and so on. And then you have like the BAP clan, I don't know what you call them, the Vitalists,
Pirates, the
Pirates, the Barbarians, I guess.
I don't know, Barbarians, yeah. I
Barbarians
guess.
is a perfect. So you have the Barbarian clan against the religious fundamentalist clan, and really around the idea of what is the most effective way of opposing the system. And it's gotten to the point where it's like the Barbarian clan is making fun of the religious fundamentalists for emphasizing large families, essentially, and family formation and spending time with your kids. In a very funny way.
I don't think they just to clear up, I don't think they dissed the Trads for having a lot of kids. I think they dissed specifically the men for being chained to their families. Meanwhile, the Trads see this as a point of pride, right?
Yes, Academic Agent did I think they did an unpopular opinions on this where they talked about, okay, what is masculinity? I mean, is it masculine to spend time with your kids, for example? And I mean, I come down on the side of the Academic Agent and saying that even being a dad myself and spending time with kids, I know that this is not the pinnacle of masculinity, and ideally in a different time I would not be doing it as much. I mean, it's really because of certain limitations and that's been posed upon you in the modern world.
I think
right?
the important point here is that, if I remember correctly, that particular thing was about whether wiping your 1-year-old's bottom is a heroic act of masculinity, and obviously it isn't, and obviously it isn't gendered in any way. It's just something that needs to be done, and it's something that we've talked about before when it comes to the roles of men and women, is that in the day-to-day, there are so many things that are just, work items, things that need to be done. And it doesn't really matter which one does it, or although, a man might be better suited for one thing there than another, but that's not where you find peak masculinity. That's not where you find peak femininity, right?
No.
It's pointless. It's pointless to claim, filing taxes as a feminist act, because you're liberating yourself in doing it. No, you're just doing busy work, right?
But I do think there are a lot of people in the feminist sphere who make a big point of that, of wanting to say file their own taxes or have control of their own economy as a point in favor of feminism, right?
Yeah, of course, but that's the same reason that why the Trads are saying that having kids, like getting a woman pregnant and sticking around, is just as unheroic as filing your taxes. But I mean, we're layers deep here on on what this is. I mean, it's getting very autistic very quickly. I see Nordan on saying this is incredibly autistic to
but
our quarrel about.
Yeah, I agree, but I mean, you see the picture here, right? You have I don't know if this is like the American style of the Longhouse or something with the BAP concept that you essentially have the men that are just kind of chained in these longhouses where they worship the primordial mother that's pictured there. You know, it's from like these older sculptures, like where they made of these voluptuous women. Um, and it's really the idea that you're sort of you're always kind of controlled by these kind of plump women in a sense, and that's not really masculine. You're
Right.
It is in a
You're
sense
not
like
free
you're sort of
in the masculine sense. Right.
Like they would say like the liberals are cucked in a sense, like it's sort of being longhoused. It's like it become like the new pejorative term. And as much as I do agree with wiping your baby's ass is not peak masculinity, playing catch with your son is not peak masculinity, but at the same time, there's something about like trying to attack people for this that it's not very helpful. I feel like it's just the kind of like barbarian mythology around that. It can be quite destructive in having people just sitting and justifying to themselves being total losers on the other end. Like, I mean, maybe you could be this lunar male who is just pursuing your interests and being a badass barbarian or something, but in reality you're just
male.
kind of the solar male. Sorry,
well,
being the solar male.
That's where you get into the weird, like, because the difference in I guess we can't use the solar and the lunar male because then we're wading into like Evola territory, and Evola is kind of weird on all of this as well, because he would see someone being solar as someone who is what would he say? He would probably say that it's sort of the king is both warrior and priest. But I feel that in that conception, you've already put the idea of civilization, and I feel like a lot of these barbarian types are against a lot of the concepts of civilization, which, don't get me wrong, I understand where they're coming from, right? That's part of the masculine to sort of go off and do your own thing and let no one define you but you and your actions and what you can take for yourself. But that's different parts of the cycle, and I feel that you might find pockets within the cycle you're currently in, but unless you're in that cycle, you're just going to do yourself a disservice if you do either of if you go too hard on the trad and if you go too hard on the barbarian in the current cycle, right? Because currently it's all about just trying to survive. I mean, that's why we're all here, right?
Yes, I feel like this is a sort of luxury. It's like this typical thing with people on the right wing to say, "Oh, the left wing is eating itself." Oh, look, the left wing is eating itself. Like they're casting their own out over these petty disputes because they can't agree on who's like a real trans person or something. But then we start doing this bullshit, right? So like, let's just start attacking people who take pride in having families.
And no one purity spirals like the right.
I mean, what is? I mean, it's this combination of like super funny but also completely counterproductive. I mean, I get, like, I know that a lot of people are suspicious of Matt Walsh here, who's the one that Royal Nationalist is replying to, but still, it's like it is a little bit cheap. This is not the most productive way to spend your time.
That's true. And well, I don't know where we're going to land on this, because it's hard for me to agree with either of these sort of extremes, because, as I said, I think both of them are right in different cycles, but in the current cycle, none of this really matters, right?
And hash this
I
out
know that sounds like
we win,
black-pilled, but yeah, I guess. Yeah, once we win, but that's also the thing, like, clear them out, I guess. Once we win, then we can bicker about this stuff, right? We can send the barbarians off to fight wars, I guess, or I don't know. we can make like a small longhouse for Matt Walsh to to hang out in, for the Mormons and the Christians too.
We're all gonna do, that's when we're gonna do the wars again with the barbarians against the Longhousers or whatever. I mean, it's so difficult because it's so funny. Like that's the problem with Twitter. It's like these super infectious, funny memes. It is bullying culture just put on
This meme here is
steroids.
funny.
Really, yeah.
The one on the screen here is funny. I laughed when I saw it. Right?
Yeah.
It's a very good takedown of Matt Walsh's position here. But I mean, the world is complex, and both of these things can be true in a sense at the same time, right?
Yeah, I agree.
That's why in these discussions, someone like Academic Agent have been having with this whole solar and lunar, there are men and women who, in a sense, are all over that spectrum, right? And in real life, and I don't want to sound like some weird like gender lefty bullshit, but I mean the reality is that you know the expression of your masculinity or femininity, your yin and yang, etc., is complicated, and it is a spectrum, right? You'll have men who act feminine, you'll have women who act masculine, and you can say that, oh, they're, you know, operating against their mode of being, but then suddenly, you know, the most masculine woman you know gets a child and she just flips around because her hormones went crazy for 9 months, right? You can't just say a definitive statement on a lot of this. You can't just say, well, everyone just needs to, you know, go raid, I don't know, the nearest the nearest farm, or I don't know what the idea would be. How do you do barbarianism in 2023 versus how do you do, you know, all a man wants to do is come home from a long day of work to a grateful wife and children who are glad to see him and dinner cooking. Like, how do you do that in 2023?
Yeah, I mean, if you can of course argue that you dedicate yourself to like a full sort of mission essentially, and an ideological mission. But how many people are actually doing that contra the people who are just sitting on Twitter and shitting on Matt Walsh and saying they're barbarians?
And you know, I'll applaud someone like, I guess, Bronze Age pervert or anyone else who suntans their balls for going at it, and I wish them all the best. I just don't see where that takes our civilization, and I guess that's the point. They don't care, right?
Yes, I mean they just represent the energy, but of course I'm not going to use this pejorative, Longhouse, unless it's like really, really, really appropriate. I don't want to propagate this meme any further, even though
I've seen it.
I mean, maybe we have already, but
as many memes do, they tend to, you know, be overused when they're first discovered, and then they quickly lose meaning. I feel. All right, I don't know if we should spend any more time on this.
I think we've covered it enough. We could
feel
get
like
into
I just
Burnham now.
Keep talking in circles or say something stupid. So, all right, so we're returning to The Machiavellians, The Defenders of Freedom by James Burnham, and we are going to be talking about part 4, 5, 6, and 7, in which he starts by talking about George Sorel.
Yeah, it's not George Soros; it's George Sorel. No. So we have to really emphasize
Sorel.
it.
Yes.
But I'm listening to the audio book read that's been read by this text to speech. I mean, I can almost not hear the difference between Soros and Sorel. Like every time he says George Soros. So I think it's he's saying George Soros, but no, just George Soros is the Open Society Foundation man, and George Sorel is the political theorist,
French political theorist,
anarcho-syndicalist.
Or was he Swiss? I don't remember. That's a very short part, but I think it contains a lot of important points. And we talked about before the stream went live that. And we'll get into the nitty gritty of it. That a couple of months ago, we ended up talking about the need of a myth to enact political action, or I suppose violence, and the role of the myth. That throwing away the myth wholesale is stupid. That you need a myth. You don't have to believe in it, but you need it. And I feel like that is pretty much what the chapters on Sorel dictate.
Yes, I mean, to put some context into it, like the first chapter we covered on the last stream is the chapter on Dante Alighieri, right? Which he gets a bit of a spanking from James Burnham for being full of cope, in a sense, just writing completely kind of ideological, transcendental fantasy nonsense in the view of James Burnham that's not scientifically verifiable. So he just gets completely shredded by Burnham. And Sorel is a little bit different. Although James Burnham disagrees with George Sorel, he venerates Sorel quite a bit. He has a lot of respect for Sorel and spends time explaining why he's a scientific thinker. At least for within the sphere of political science, he is as close to a scientific thinker as you can be. He is just way ahead of almost everybody else. And what he does explore is really the idea of the myth of violence, in a sense, trying to legitimize violence from the perspective of some type of common myth. And for context, like I mentioned, George Sorel was an anarcho-syndicalist, which is it really is a sort of a meme ideology. I think I heard about it. You've seen the flag, right, with the sort of pole and balls, and you see it with all of these kind of political compass memes. So, for me, this has always just been a sort of meme ideology. But when I've started digging around a little bit, it actually is a thing. There are people, like even in Scandinavia, that have organized themselves as anarcho-syndicalists. And we, just as a quick rundown of what exactly it is. They are basically ANCOMs and like anarcho-communists who believe that society should be run by labor unions. I know that's like a very short, kind of almost crude overview of it, but they do not believe, in a sense, in hierarchies, leaderships. They rejected the Soviet Union, in a sense, for being too managerial in its approach. They sort of acknowledge the fact that this is not the classless society that we were promised. And they do hold hard onto the idea that there's going to be no hierarchy. It's just going to be like this interlocking chain of different labor unions that are able to sort of coordinate action between themselves. And I guess like anarcho-capitalists, they have like 1,000-page books explaining exactly how this is supposed to work. Just for context, this is where Sorel is coming from, and the myth, in a sense, that he uses, and the myth that he talks about, is really like the myth of the strike, and how
or
like
the French
idea...
Revolution. I think he references, which I think is important, because and if you want me to, or if you'll allow me to interrupt you a bit more, I have a quote here from the book in which he explains what the myth is.
Yeah, go ahead.
A myth, in contrast to a hypothesis or a utopia, is not either true or false. The facts can never prove a myth wrong. Quote, a myth cannot be refuted, since it is, at bottom, identical with the convictions of a group, being the expression of these convictions in the language of movement, and it is, in consequence, unanalyzable into parts which could be placed on the plane of historical descriptions. So that's from Reflections on Violence by Sorel. And to go back to our previous episode, when I quoted about the French Revolution from the same book, when Napoleon came to power and basically turned France into an autocracy, nobody really minded that, in effect, the ideas of the revolution hadn't been implemented, but the myth had, right?
Yes. A lot of his
Policies,
views on the myth is really from like this kind of political science, like hard Machiavellian political science perspective, is that I think Burnham says that like George Sorel is sort of in the borderland between what he would consider Machiavellian and a sort of non-Machiavellian thinker. That Machiavellian in this book basically means political science, the term, like you see yourself as a sort of scientist of politics, scientifically approaching the question of politics. And Sorel tries to use the myth scientifically, basically seeing that the myth has utilitarian value in terms of trying to anchor political violence, in the sense in how and how political violence can be perceived as something that is noble
Yep.
and something that is in service of a larger cause than yourself, and something that can also move social movements and social revolutions forward. And of course, like the French Revolution myth of the egalite, fraternity, and what's the last one there? Liberté. That would have, of course, been an example of the myth for Sorel, and from this kind of anarcho-syndicalist ANCOM perspective. It's really the myth of like the universal strike, of then like the sort of complete dictatorship of the proletariat. Every worker is going to leave their post and oppose upon basically the bourgeoisie, the capitalists, a complete stop in society, and that will continue until they can come back and reform society into something that is more, egalitarian. Let's say less. That is less of a what do you call this sort of unfair, unjust hierarchy? I guess that that's someone like Chomsky. Chomsky would say. So he's very much in trying to argue that you need to have these myths, and that they can be used as a tool of change. They can be used to contextualize violence, because if you don't have, if you don't have any kind of overarching myth, then you just have senseless violence. You just have brutality in a sense. But when you have the myth, then that's when you also have the heroism that can put violence into context, and they can also diminish violence. At least that's Sorel's idea, that when you have the myth, you only need a few cases. Like you could have a few people who would die as martyrs. Like he uses the Christian martyrs as an example. He said it's relatively few, Christian martyrs who sacrificed themselves, but the impact of that was so big because it's not just data points. In a sense, it's connected to like a larger metaphysical.
It's images and concepts that evoke emotions and willingness to act in people before any sort of analysis is done, really, before any considerations are done. So it has to be sort of base feeling type images.
Exactly, and tied to really sort of a narrative, right? And I mean, if you want to see some current or more current examples of this, I mean, it just struck me how like the story of George Floyd, for example, is very much in like how do you use certain violence or like martyrdom in a service of like a larger myth. That it's really more connected to the idea of the social justice and the plight of the black man in America and so on, and like the idea of the police brutality is that you can have one incident that is in a sense nailed in the public consciousness as part of this mythical framework, and then you don't need that many events. You just need a few that you can elevate into this absolute mythical status. And
I mean,
with the combination
of
like
well-known event would be the Martin Luther King Jr. speech, right? I mean, that's the basis for the entire boomer generation, pretty much, right?
Exactly.
And ours to a certain extent. I mean, we're just lucky we sort of avoided some of that.
So it's not a flimsy concept, as Burnham says here. Like he has a lot of respect for Sorel because of this, because it's not like a dumb idea to bring forward that the myth can be powerful, even from like a political science perspective. It's not just like this bleeding heart emotional idea, but Burnham does come down on the side of saying that it's actually not useful, because if you look at like he uses the French Revolution as an example, like the myth didn't stop the bloodshed in a sense. Like you've seen a lot of especially in the previous century, like the myth didn't do much to mitigate all of these mass murders that happened in the last century. And he goes more into detail in the book about how exactly it doesn't. But I mean, to be honest, I'm a little bit split on it. I actually see Sorel's point here, and I feel like Burnham's refutation, it's a relatively short refutation. It's not like a very thorough, I'm going to go through every example and explain why it's wrong. Or
don't want to, go after the person and not the argument too much. But I am left with a feeling that, Burnham is salty that it didn't win. And that's why he's refuting it. If communism had turned out to be the way he would have wanted it, he would have thought that Sorel was right. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, that's a good point, actually. I didn't think of that immediately, but well, we have to think of that. I
I
mean,
feel like I can
yeah.
do that a couple of times because he starts his book doing it to Dante. So
Yeah, exactly. I mean, he opened the door for that, so he has to be able to tolerate it. I mean, it is the sort of thing that goes back into this book is really like Burnham's love of science, and if there's one of the things that is kind of dated with the whole idea is like the version of quote unquote science that Burnham champions in this book. It's not the one we have now. It's he doesn't
didn't
really
quite pan
include,
out that way. No.
well, he didn't include, say like the ideas that came in of, say, falsifiability of certain, like harder emphasis on mathematics, statistical models, and so on. I mean,
Well, at the
this
end
is
of the day,
it
it's
is
still a social science, right?
yeah.
And it turns out that 100 or I guess 75 years after Burnham wrote this, the social sciences weren't really that robust against outside influence, and so then everything that he has written here is true, but it also invalidates the idea that this can be any form of truth. It just is, right? It's an analysis on the nature of human institutions and the flow of
I
power
mean,
in human societies, but it can't be scientific because it goes against that core of it being human and a flow of power, right?
I mean, in my view, this book is good because James Burnham is good. It's not because like he has figured out the key to, because like this
Exactly.
positivist view of science that he champions here was just objectively the correct version or his
No, he's
view on
compiled a
democracy.
good
But
set of thoughts and thinkers into a comprehensive book that presents sort of
yes,
a
and
thread
he
going
he is
back
very
to
he is
Machiavelli.
very smart, right? And he has a lot of experience, and that's why the book is good. Not because it's like following this approach of science. I think you can have people who are less talented who will try to use the scientific method the way that Burnham presents it, which is really this sort of positivist induction-based science, and just come up with complete junk because they lack the intelligence or the experience. I mean, it made me think of like, you have books like Exit, Voice, and Loyalty by Albert Hirschman, which I mean, a lot of these sort of social science books from like the 60s and 70s that just have like no references to anything, but they're still really great books because they're made by great men, in a sense. And
yeah,
like
I
that's
mean,
sort of my takeaway here
as you
as well.
said, you get a lot of good stuff in between the lines, sort of reading this. Okay.
Yeah, I think we've covered enough on.
I think we covered
Sorrel.
enough on Sorel. Next up, he covers Robert Michel's. This is quite a bit of a bigger chapter. And Michel's, who, well, we'll start with the iron law of oligarchy, which is probably the thing, if you've been following the spheres, quote unquote, for any while, you'll know or have heard about the iron law of oligarchy, which, let me see if I have the quote here. Oh, Google refreshed. Okay, very cool. I have it on the fact of leadership. Do you have any thoughts on
I can just start babbling a little bit about Michel's.
Yes, just do that. And
So he's sort of an Italian-German sociologist. I mean, he did become sort of fascist later in life, if I understood his bio correctly. I mean, what makes him interesting is that he did a lot of deep dives into organizations, basically, and trying to do case studies of looking at, say, organizations like labor unions, political parties, and so on, and seeing how they actually function contra how they're expected to function. So, I mean, it's a sort of recurring theme in this book is that you have to see through like the stated or the formal meaning and look at the actual meaning behind it. And Robert Michel's project is to look at the idea of democracy, or really like the sovereign citizen, and see like how much of that formal meaning is actually carried through in the practical applications of how organizations are run in reality, as it says. And he really does come to the conclusion that like this sovereign citizenship is it's not possible, like in any sense. And he goes through basically certain facts about how organizations have to operate that just make this impossible. Did you want to read the quote first, or do you?
I have a page and a half here that basically sums all of this up from Burnham's book. If you want me to just read it,
Yeah, do that.
Just interrupt me if you have any comments along the way. Democratic theory is based upon the principle of self-government. The persons belonging to a social group are, according to democratic theory, able to and properly ought to govern themselves. It is possible to imagine and even to discover social groups in which this theory is fully realized. Such would be a small company of adults, half a dozen or so, united for some jointly held purpose, business or recreation or crime, whatever it might be, who shared the same interests and level of culture, and who reached decisions unanimously after an adequate discussion by what we call a meeting of the minds. Certainly such groups, which are not unknown, can be intelligibly said to be practicing, with respect to their organized purpose, self-government. Their members are, plainly enough, governing themselves. However, as soon as the group becomes at all large, and the politically important groups of modern civilized society are very large, it is necessary, still retaining the democratic intention, to introduce arbitrary rules that are not wholly in accord with the democratic theory. For example, the group has to be redefined in such a way as to exclude certain individuals who are nevertheless subject to its decisions. Children, up to a certain arbitrarily determined age, criminals, insane persons, and so on. Usually, it may be added additional restrictions apply in practice even when not in theory. Property and racial and educational restrictions, to mention some of the most prominent. Secondly, since in larger groups we seldom get opinions that are both freely given and unanimous, it is necessary to accept the decision of a numerical majority as the decision of the entire group. Both of these qualifications are obviously unavoidable, and no sensible person could object to them. Nevertheless, it should not be overlooked that they do contradict strict democratic theory, even though it is easy enough for a clever philosopher to patch up the theory in order to allow for them. They are enough to show that strict and full democracy is not possible in practice. However, having noted this, we shall accept them as a legitimate emendation of democratic theory and go on to inquire whether democracy thus circumscribed is compatible with the facts of an organization. Even if we accept majority opinion as democratically valid for the entire group, it is at once plain that in the case of large groups, strict or direct democracy is impossible for mechanical and technical reasons. Large group cannot itself directly decide about its own affairs because there is no place big enough to permit a large group to assemble for discussion and decision. Even if the group is sufficiently small to be contained within one place, the study of crowd psychology shows that the decisions voted by a large crowd seldom reflect the considered opinions of the constituent members of the crowd. Choices have to be limited to a few simple alternatives, whereas a great number of divergent views may actually be held by various individuals. Only a few speakers can be heard, not all who think they have something to say. The devices of oratory, appeals to irrelevant sentiment, enthusiasm, boredom, and weariness sway the crowd while it remains together. In a large assembly, votes are very often unanimous by acclamation, when a survey of the individuals either before or shortly after the meeting would show large minorities or even a majority against the voted policy. All of these characteristics of the crowd are well known. Even if they could be overcome, or should be disregarded, the simple fact remains that the operating political groups that function in developed societies, the state itself or mass political parties, are far too large and too scattered in residence to be brought together in one place at one time. In reaching group decisions, there is no technical means to bring the will of the group, even if this could somehow be determined, directly to bear upon the problem at hand. Cultural and psychological...
I could just...
It skips here later if you want to comment on this part
I
first.
could just chip in here and have a bit of kind of breakdown of the things that we just read. And the conclusion is that leadership, or at least let's say oligarchic leadership, meaning a smaller group leading a larger majority, is a fact. It is a function of scale. Basically, there's no way that you can have, say, a group of 5,000, 50,000, 500,000 people that does not have a sort of small oligarchic leadership to lead it. The first problem is, of course, the problem of speed. that groups need to make decisions fast. If you have any experience at all, whether it's you're working volunteer work, you're working in the public or private sector or so on, you know that decisions need to be made quickly for there to be efficiency, and that cannot be done if you're going to include, let's say, all 50,000 people in the organization every time you make a decision. The other problem is that, which he already says, is that you cannot. I mean, you can have 5 people in a room who will sit and talk into each other's mouths, and at the end they're able to sort of reach a consensus agreement, but you cannot have 5,000 people sitting in a mess hall talking to each other and reaching a conclusion. Then that will have to be delegated to specific people who will have like representative leadership responsibility. So it is really like imagining as you go, like say you have biological organisms. We'll start with something simple like a snail, for instance. So it doesn't have any bones, or like a very simple systems for digesting food. But as you move on to like say like an amphibian or a mammal or more complex creatures, you need more complex organs in that body. And the same thing with organizations. Organizations need the brain, and the brain is the leadership in a sense. And without the brain, the leadership the organization cannot function.
The commands have to flow from the brain to the rest of the body.
Yes.
And this next part here, I don't know if you want me to read it, but that pretty much covers that part.
Yeah, I mean, and he does say that, like, so you always end up with having a small group of people who specialize in these activities that has to do with organizing the larger group into a cohesive whole so that they can act. The problem is that, okay, in theory, like the democratic theorists will try to patch this up and say that, well, it's representative democracy. So you see, they are up there representing your will. They're actually just a representation of like your aggregate preference. But Michel disproves this in saying that it's really quite the opposite. It's the people who are sitting on top who can affect the kind of the mass will, and it's really not the other way around. And if you've seen all of the streams that have been done on propaganda, on influence, on like these various techniques of manipulating the mass man, you know that this is true. You know that like the small organized group that can sit on top and expose people to information and make the choices and they manipulate the procedural outcomes, they will always have power over the large group that is unorganized. So it is really just leadership is just a fact. It is always like a small group of specialists that will be doing this leadership, and they will have leverage over the larger group. And like just as a matter of technicality, there's no other ways to even run large organizations, at least not the way we know of right now, which is the reason why like the Soviet Union was just as managerial as, let's say, United States under Roosevelt, or whether it would be Nazi Germany. Like you run into the same type of structures simply out of necessity.
Yeah, if you're going to organize yourself because you're going to do certain activities as the government, this is how it's going to turn out. And that's pretty much it. Now the iron law of oligarchy itself, I don't know if we have the actual quote here, but it's pretty much this is the concept that any organization that grows in size will tend towards oligarchy, and away
for
from,
the reasons,
from democracy.
Yeah, just explained. And of course, if you go back to the previous thinker Sorel, I mean, I guess the anarcho-syndicalism is a sort of attempt on using structures to avoid this, right? Because this is what you're seeing with the almost like the sort of copish part of the left, and especially the online left right now, where they'll talk about like workplace democracies, for instance, or
worker co-ops,
the co-ops and all of these other type of structures. Which, I mean, of course, if you'd examine the internal workings of these co-ops, you'd find that they work in exactly the same way, of having like a small group of leaders that can manipulate the procedural outcomes, and there's really no. It's very hard to find a way around this.
It's like a small team that has decided to share the profits. That's the difference. But I mean, one guy is still the boss, right?
Yeah,
he's still calling the shots. He's still deciding, what are we gonna do today to make sure production is still running, right?
I mean, you talked to me about having watched a lot of Richard Wolff videos, and well, he'll try to bring up a lot of examples on how you can do a worker co-op and so on. And it's always really simple examples. It's like a bakery with 5 people who who work there and so on. And yeah, of course you can do
It's
that if
always
you have
small enough not to be able to pull it off. It's not never large organizations. It's never on the level of government or even tribe. We're talking teams. We're talking scrum teams, basically, for the
Yeah.
IT people in the audience. And even in scrum teams or agile teams, you have clearly defined leadership roles, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And people who call the shots on what should be developed and what shouldn't.
Yeah, I mean, larger groups, and we're living in the era of the large group, right? I mean, the groups have never been larger than they are now, even though we talk about how like the family units have been smashed and the local bowling teams have been smashed.
The
And,
Longhouse devours us all.
the Longhouse have eaten us, but we have now political units. Nations are enormous political units, and you have like even above the nations, like these sort of over-national bodies, the globalists, these organizations that go even above that, like the European Union and so on, and they have to, the bigger they are, the more oligarchic they have to become. There's no way around that, and we're completely surrounded by it. I mean, of course, if we did live in like the Viking era or something, and we would be insulated from all of this, and we didn't have to think about like the iron law of oligarchy and how exactly we're supposed to engineer these mega organizations. But
well, I mean, it would be a fact of life, because I mean the selector would just be different. It's not that, it's not who's gonna be the treasurer. It's who's gonna be the chieftain and who's gonna be his son, right?
Yeah, but I mean,
but
it was
the reality
back
would be
then.
the same, right?
Yeah, but it was simpler. Like, you wouldn't be exposed to the level of complexity that we are today in terms of
course not.
how this
Of
is
course
applied or how visible this has to become. I mean, you could live in these villages of like 100 people, and you could tell yourself that it's totally democratic or whatever.
There
but,
was more room for activities, yes.
Yeah, and that everybody could be heard at least a little bit. But now it's like you just have these absolute masses.
Yeah, it's just going to come down from the top. You'll own nothing and you'll be happy, and we have to do it this way because we're the government, and we're going to lower the temperature of the earth or something.
Yes, and of course, I think there is a sort of lesson here. I mean, there's a lot of lessons, I think, from Burnham and from Machiavellian theory, political science, that I feel like are lost on a lot of people. And even though like you read all of it, there's still certain things that where you're not really able to swallow the implications. And I feel, especially like for populists, this is a bit of a tough pill to swallow, because you have all these people who talk about direct democracy, and they want to. They want to have the voice of the people heard and so on. I mean, you're seeing this. You're running,
and then you can vote, and
you're running into a wall.
And most people wouldn't care, right?
You're kind of running into a wall with this stuff. That like the problem is a lot bigger in a sense than you think it is. It's not just like getting the app or like doing whatever. There are certain political realities here that it does seem like some political factions.
Even the senators can't be bothered to read their own bills. Why should I?
Yes.
Right.
Yeah, exactly. But I mean, there are certain
they're getting
political
paid
factions
to do it
who seem a lot more enlightened on this stuff, and unfortunately, those are usually more on the left than on the right.
Unfortunately,
so yeah.
There's one more cycle of Trump, and then we got him.
Another populist, please. Just it's right around the corner, folks. Crushing. Steve Turley told me that
Patriots in control. Yeah. Do we want to move on to Pareto?
Yeah, we can do it successfully or not, because I feel like this is he is one of the tougher characters to cover. And I mean, he is kind of the godfather of the sort of Italian school. I mean, you could say that Machiavelli is the godfather, but I mean, the whole idea of the elite theory, in a sense,
sort of built a house on the foundation that Machiavelli maybe he laid it, right? Or I suppose he built a castle in fields on it.
Because I mean, this guy is also like this kind of polymath, multi-talent.
Yeah.
And he is mostly known. I mean, you see the term Pareto used in finance, right?
Yep.
There's this company, there's this investment firm in Norway that it's just called Pareto. They'll talk about like the Pareto distribution and how, I mean, for those of you who lived under a rock, it's basically the 80-20 rule. That's the Pareto distribution. That's the,
it's to be fair, it's not a scientific rule. It's a bit of a heuristic that he came up with, right?
The thing is that
economic phenomena.
from the perspective of like Burnham's version of science, it is science, right? I mean,
That's fair.
like
Yeah.
the modern version of this kind of Karl Popper science. It's not really scientific, but like the way Burnham talks about it, then you can just kind of abstract these general rules from observation. That it's completely within the ballpark of what he considered science. But I mean, it's like you said, it's a useful heuristic. And it does apply to larger systems. It does seem like if you pay attention, you can watch an organization grow from a small organization with maybe 3 people to a larger one with 3,000.
Oh yeah.
And I guarantity you that you will see like
and
this
I'll
kind
agree
of
that
80-20 rule.
if that's the idea of Burnham's scientific view on things, then yeah, it's definitely, it's if the threshold here is this thing useful, then the 80-20 rule or the Pareto distribution is definitely scientific, right? Because it replicates quite a lot in real life.
Yes, I mean, of course, it's you could see it from that kind of like the John Dewey utilitarian. What is that view? Like the pragmatist view of truth and so on. But
yeah,
like
but I'm not sure if that's what Burnham means really.
No, it's really in the history.
It's scientific, but is it though? Right?
Yeah, in the history of science, I think it's called positivism basically, and the idea that you could use induction to arrive at scientifically true conclusions, which was later sort of debunked because of the deduction problem. But
and I'm all for that, but you'll have to be extremely careful what you're picking as your canon, right?
Yeah. But I mean, even though it's like an older iteration of science, it's still incredibly useful as a heuristic, as you said. So he's famous for like the 80-20 rule that he just noticed as a sort of matter of fact from observing, I think, his vegetable garden or something. Like 80%, like 20% of the people produce 80% of the peas, and he started to just notice this trend across various fields. But inevitably, him being a social scientist, if you are to take this to its conclusion, then you have to conclude that, well, in human societies, 20% of the people will have 80% of the power. And inside of that 20%, there's going to be another 80-20, where the 20% of the 20% will have like an 80 times 80% of the power and so on. So it's going to be like a very kind of pyramid-shaped system. And like this is where elite theory comes in. It maps onto the iron law of oligarchy almost perfectly. So, but he had a lot of other ideas as well, which we'll get into. The like he talks about logical and non-logical action. That is a big part of the first chapter, where he sort of says that most of human action is not logical, and that might sound a little bit counterintuitive. There are, I mean, to those of you who've read economic theory, you have like the idea of rational choice theory that kind of implies that all human action is in a sense rational, in the sense that they're trying to attain a goal and taking action to attain that goal. So all action is sort of analyzed into a kind of rational perspective. But for Pareto, this is not the case at all. He says that like logical actions can only be actions that are undertaken in the context of, for example, craft, where a person has a specific goal that has, let's say, like firm parameters in terms of the goal. Like, okay, I'm trying to build a bridge, and I want the bridge to be 20 feet across and 10 feet wide, and it has to be built of a certain type of material within a certain time frame, and these actions are, they can be said to be logical. And everything that's not within like this very narrow purview of like numerical measurements, it's for Pareto, it's not logical at all. It's like, say, sports is not logical for him. War is not logical. Religion is not logical. Like social institutions aren't logical. So it does go. It all falls down to basically sentiment, or it's like a sort of deeper feeling inside of people that kind of drive them towards doing certain things. So I don't know if you have a quote or anything. Think we could read to maybe flesh this out a little.
Not really, because I found this part of found it very sort of self-explanatory. in the way that Burnham writes it. Let me see if I can find.
So he
Let's see here.
uses the term residues, at least that's sort of what I picked up, and he says that like that's a sort of basic impulse in a human being that's kind of driving these, irrational actions, and the residue is the underlying motivation for human behavior, and
But I think what he's sort of building up under here is partially that he's taking Pareto's idea of the non-logical and tying that to Sorel's myth, sort of, and saying that the myth or the utopian part of the myth is usually very often part of the non-logical action.
Yes. James Burnham does point out in this chapter that if you do observe people without reading, just trying to be a little bit objective, you'll see that people are usually completely irrational, and that they're not really. I mean, you can have the examples that he comes with. You can have societies that on paper are against, let's say, adultery. They're against drinking and gambling, but gambling and drinking and adultery is very widespread in those societies. You can have people go and speak out against certain things, and they will do that exact thing afterward. I mean, it's much more common than you think to have like these people who are walking contradictions in a sense. Who it's really like the logical human being that's kind of the exception in this case. The people who just sort of are 100% consistent across time. That is almost a sort of non-entity that you see in the world. Most actions are not logical. They're driven by these kind of residues or these basic impulses, and these impulses remain relatively constant across time. So this always has to be taken into account when understanding human actions, is that it's really driven by a kind of impulse. It's not. It has very little to do with like direct kind of rationally seeking to attain certain goals.
It also draws a line sort of off the map of this book into the Austrian School of Economics, because they follow this line into saying that you should always follow the revealed preference of a consumer, for example, or an economic entity, not the stated preference, because you can't trust people in what they say they want. You have to look at what they actually buy, for example.
Yeah, that sounds about right. So
that's
circulation
beyond the
of
scope
elites.
of Burnham. Yeah.
Yeah. Let's say the circulation of elites is another idea that he brings in terms of regime change, and how basically, we've already established that you have, societies are fundamentally oligarchical as a sort of necessity, and that there are certain events like revolutions and revolutions, both in terms of like political struggle and technological revolutions and so on, that lead to circulations of elites. I don't know if you have some bullet points here, because I'm a little bit short on on my info.
Forces. He describes what he calls the forces of social equilibrium, which is sort of the things that keep the current system in the position it is in, which also determines what the elite looks like. So let's see here what Pareto believes the chief of these forces to be the following. Number one, the physical environment, climate, geographical factors, the like, is plainly of great importance, etc. Number two is residues are very influential. We didn't cover residues and derivations. Do we want to do that before? Because that's a very difficult.
No, I did talk about residues.
Oh, did you? Sorry,
it's really a form of impulse, but derivations, I'm not. I don't think.
Well, derivations are a part of this whole thing. Let me just pull that up here. Here, let's see. The derivations are actions that tend to be. Where did that quote go? I need to derivations. So let us illustrate the distinctions by examples. Pareto records a long list of non-logical practices in many tribes, groups, and nations, which have have their ostensible purpose the control of weather conditions. Sometimes the practice is to sacrifice a bull or a cock or a goat, sometimes to manipulate certain material objects, sometimes you repeat certain formulas. The most extreme and concrete differences are observable. Often, along with the practice, there is a theory which supposedly explains why the practice is able to affect the weather, because a god is thereby appropriated or something of the sort. These varying concrete practices, together with the explanatory theories, are all derivations. So, whenever he's talking about derivations, he's talking about actions that follow these residues, which are societal-wide background impulses, I suppose. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
Yeah. Okay.
I think it's. I was trying to say some of the same things. So I think we're in agreement.
So the first thing we mentioned as these social equilibrium forces are the physical environment. The second is the residues, meaning that sort of the mood, I suppose, of the chakra of society itself changes over time. And
vibes, as the Zoomers say.
The vibes, yes, change, and then the elites fail the vibe check, right? Economic factors, obviously. Derivations do have an influence on the social equilibrium, but according to Pareto, these are very minor and certainly usually not what leads to change in the makeup of the elites. And then lastly, there is the actual circulation of the elites. So these are the things that make up the state of the society or the elites. And the final one, the circulation of the elites, is the idea of the governing and the non-governing elite, which then cycles over time due to economic, technical, scientific advantages and disadvantages. And you have the governing elite, which is usually the visible part of the elite. Someone like the President of the United States and his cabinet, right? The king and his advisors, etc. And then you have the non-governing elite, which is, on one side, the non-governing elite that's part of the structure that props up the governing elite, so the bureaucrats. But I'd like to add sort of my own, I guess, non-governing elite, which would be the dissidents, right? The people who are either ascending or descending at any moment to oppose the governing and non-governing elite. But this is my own thoughts, right? Does that make sense, Ludwig?
Yeah, it does. He does. I think he does divide them into these. He uses these the lion and fox dichotomy as well from Machiavelli.
Exactly. So, but the important part is, you have the king, and then you have the bureaucrats and the treasurers, who sort of do the day-to-day operation, and not the I suppose you would say like the leadership or the mythological positions are not for the non-governing elite, right? But they're still part of sort of the ruling class. Someone like journalists in our society would be considered a non-governing elite, especially if definitely if they're writing for, one of the top papers who are pro-regime, right?
Yes, I can't argue with that. I mean, journalists have an obscene amount of power, even though they're not like economically, impressive. But let's say, I mean, if you have a paper that's being read by the other elites, it does a lot to coordinates both ideas and behavior among these groups. Moldbug has done a lot on that already. I mean, the cathedral model is basically like the sort of media run.
It's a very good. It's been a lot of work done to sort of map this in our current society. But what Pareto is trying to outline here is just sort of like a general society and history-wide model that can explain any society at any time. You just got to know where to look for these governing elites, the non-governing elites, and then if you want to see how things get spicy, you should also look for, in my opinion, you should also look for the potential dissidents, because that's the only group that the governing and non-governing elite care about. I mean, the masses are uninteresting to them, right?
Yes, the rival castles as the who's that guy?
Exactly.
I don't remember his name. It escapes me.
Wow, I had it, and
power
now
guy.
yeah. Someone in the chat might help us. Who's the rival castles guy? It's on the tip of
Juvenile,
my
I
tongue.
think.
Juvenal.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. Is there anything else we want to talk about with Pareto? I mean, this is a big and complicated chapter, and it's hard for us to do all of this in.
Yeah, I think Pareto
like
is the
10,
hardest one
15
to
minutes.
explain.
But it should be said that everyone who's ever I've ever seen who have ever referenced Pareto have to say that Mind and Society is absolutely huge. This is the biggest book ever written by anyone, and I believe them. And I think that's why this is, he's trying to condense this insane man's entire life's work, pretty much. I mean, insane as in highly intelligent, highly proficient, and he tries to do it in like 40 pages, right?
Yeah, it is like a theory of everything book, and like you said, few people I've heard actually explain Pareto in a way that's easy to understand. So to avoid getting too lost in the weeds, I think we should jump on to the next, the last chapter.
Will do. So the final chapter is Burnham's own sort of musings. And he has one chapter final part. He has one chapter in this part called The Nature of the Present. And he has the meaning of democracy, and then lastly, can politics be scientific? And I don't know if you have anything you wanted to start with on the nature of the present.
In the nature of the present, he does sort of line out kind of almost bullet points or numbered points in terms of, okay, what have we actually learned about politics? I mean, the answer is obviously yes. He's very much a kind of positivist science fan. He thinks that science is good. He thinks that science is useful, and he does say in this chapter that, like, okay, having science is like one of the things that we should fight for, basically. So it is a bit. I mean, with like, let's say, like the current mood in the sort of right in terms of their approach to science and their approach to experts. It's a bit of a conflict here, because there's been a sort of growing contempt toward experts, especially in our era, where we sort of see the I fucking love science people as kind of the enemy, as sort of one of the almost greater problems that we have, is kind of blind trust in science. But it has to be understood that this comes out of a different era than that we are in currently.
Yeah. It's very hard to have that positivity about these institutions that he seems to have at the point when he's writing them, right? I think in The Meaning of Democracy, I have a quote here which I think sums up a lot of his work here. If you want me to read it.
Yeah, go ahead.
Here. From a Machiavellian point of view, a social revolution means a comparatively rapid shift in the composition and structure of the elite and in the mode of its relation to the non-elite. It is possible to state the conditions under which such rapid shift takes place. The principal of these conditions are the following. Number 1, when the institutional structure and the elite, which has the ruling position within this structure, are unable to handle possibilities opened by technological advances and by the growth, for whatever reason, of new social forces. And I think that's something that is very interesting, because I think it's something that we have seen a lot in our own lifetime. The current ruling elite have, for a long time, been very bad at dealing with the internet and sort of what a can of worms that has opened up in terms of communication and organization. And to a certain extent, they're still bad, but they're getting better at it, right? But as long as they're remaining bad, they're going to be outplayed by any dissenting organizations.
Yeah, I mean, if you see there's any area in society where they are being, like you said, they're being beaten out, it's really online. I mean, you can think of so many examples whether they're just being like ratioed on Twitter or something. I mean, it sounds so trivial, right? But it really does undermine their messaging in terms of
It
like
does,
trying
yeah.
to use the internet for effective messaging when you have a comment section of people who are just making fun of you or something like
Exactly.
that. But they really have been tightening the screws, I think, after 2016.
And
With Trump.
that's what you see as that the response has been very, the response has been very, I want to say Orwellian, right? Which speaks to the fact that it's not a game they can play well, so they just have to lock it down, right? That's the safer
I mean,
option.
yeah, I think it's the easiest option for them. And there's been certain things that have happened to the internet that where it's become really more of this client server thing, and most of the traffic has been centered around just a few websites, right? They're talking about how so much of the internet now is just people on either Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, or like
You go on like
Instagram,
four
or like reposting stuff from the other pages. There's like, here's the Facebook post on Twitter, or here's the tweet that's being reposted on Facebook or something. Because in the beginning, the internet was a lot more of a Wild West situation, which is, I mean, now that all of the traffic are on these bigger sites, it's of course easier to control it when you can just try to talk to, you can just have Zuckerberg and Dorsey and these people as oligarchs, quote unquote, that you can, the intelligence agencies can just send them directives straight to them and tell them what to do. I mean, I've been thinking about stuff like, blocking, for instance, like they typically do when you have like the internet service providers, they're blocking websites now, right? Like in my workplace and so on. I can't go on BitChute, for example, or I can't go on Urban Dictionary or like Know Your Meme or something. But they will allow Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, and Google. And it's like all of the,
which is strange,
nasty stuff that I can find on BitChute, I could probably find on Twitter as well, right?
You can find more, or you could. It used to be you could potentially find more child porn on Twitter than you ever could on BitChute, right?
Yeah, exactly. So it's a bit of a can of worms. That there's like, even though they're going so hard in on trying to police this and pulling in all directions, you still see like the Superwaffen and the Boomerwaffens and all of these. The irony millennials and all it keeps just kind of poking through the cracks. If there's a single crack where the stuff can pour in, it tends to do that online. At least in my experience. So no, they can't play the meme game, but they're doing, I think, a better job at throttling the opposition here than they have previously.
I mean, that's the thing. I mean, if they can't win the meme game, just locking it down is worth the loss of resources to just lock it down, right? If they're going to win everywhere else, the fact that they're losing the meme game doesn't really matter, right?
Yeah, they've gone through a bunch of different strategies. So in the beginning, it was just sort of a Wild West, and they didn't really care. And then the internet became big, so they had to do like the full lockdown. But if you lock it down too much, then it becomes too boring, right? I mean, I don't think people even want to be on these sites if it's if you can't say anything, or you can't get any edgy content. So it seems like the dominant strategy now is these kind of digital ghettos. You allow people to just kind of stay in these spheres and post their content, but you try to manage the fact that stuff doesn't leak out of there. They kind of stay within their own little walled off communities. I mean, it is fair, containment. Yeah. That is literally containment.
Yeah, actual containment. All right. The reason number 2, or condition number 2. When a considerable percentage of the ruling class devotes little attention to the business of ruling and turns its interest to such fields as culture, art, philosophy, and the pursuit of sensuous pleasure. I mean, I watched some of the State of the Union the other day, and there's a lot of peacocking and very little ruling going on. Let's put it like that.
I didn't watch it actually. Is there any highlights that you could point to? Something that should be noted as particularly weird?
Not like one individual moment, because it's, the State of the Union is pretty much it's sort of like a pre-gamed affair. But if you want like I think the overall experience of it is what you need to watch it for, right? Just to have all of these, can I say this? To have all of these rotund melanin enriched women in tiny dresses, bring up one shooting family or victims, or sorry, bring up one family or another who have had victims of mass shootings, right? To promise that we're gonna do better, and it's not gonna get better.
It never does usually. I mean,
it's an example. There's others as well, of course.
I mean, going through these, the developments that I've had, I mean, with the internet from 2016 to 2020, getting into this more of this kind of like DR esoteric content, and like still watching these kind of mainstream things, it gets more bizarre every time. Particularly in the light of the stuff that we talked about on like the Program to Kill stream. It's kind of a closed loop, isn't it? It's like you have intelligence agencies that just that killed your family, and you're sitting there talking about
everyone in the chat is an agent, isn't it? Everyone, all of you in the chat, you're feds, except I think Leo. Leo isn't a fed.
Yeah, we got an eye on all of you. We have files on you, so.
Yeah, you all have a Fed score in an Excel document that we have. So, okay. Number 3. When an elite is unable or unwilling to assimilate rising new elements from the masses or from its own lower ranks. So, I mean, as much as we dunk on Donald Trump for it not working out, there was a real threat there. Otherwise, the screeching wouldn't have been as loud, right? But they've been exceptionally good at uplifting people from the masses, so that's not an issue, right?
Yeah, I think especially with the tech bros, this has worked out pretty well by importing these kind of like tech startup libertarians as
tech
a new
startup
form
libertarians,
of oligarchy.
The English are great at importing like technocratic Indians to be their new ruling class. So mostly
they get a good score on this one. I mean, you still have a lot of like rising discontent, but in terms of like actual competence, they seem to be able to go like brain drain people very well.
Yeah.
And
problem is that eventually it runs out. Yeah.
Yeah, let's hope.
When large sections of the elite lose confidence in themselves and the legitimacy of their own rule, and when in both elite and non-elite there is a loss of faith in the political formulas and myths that have held the societal structure together. I don't think we're anywhere near that.
No, I think maybe with like the end of communism,
after COVID, it's stronger than ever.
I mean, like with let's say like with the end of communism, I think you saw some of this stuff, but
that's true.
They seem to be able to pull a lot of people in, especially with the Ukraine stuff, and having people believe in the political formula, even though you have like I think a larger amount of discontent, you still have a very large chunk of like true believers in the population.
The political formula, right?
Yeah,
the myth is what they're selling. The ruling class, or much of it, is unable or unwilling to use force in a firm and determined way, and instead tries to rely almost exclusively on manipulation, compromise, deceit, and fraud. Now, that's certainly something that that has been increasing. Even with all the Nord Stream stuff going on, there's a lot of people saying, why did they do it in such an underhanded way, right?
Yeah, I mean, and even this is something that they do seem to be adapting to. I mean, I remember this being the talk in 2021 with the COVID and the trucker protests and so on, that, these are foxes and they can't do anything. But then they did actually roll in the police and
they rolled in the police and drained your bank accounts, and then
drained their bank accounts. So I mean, It's
When
not all
push comes to
underhanded. I mean,
shove, they're still willing to do it, and I think that's the
Yep.
key part. They have to be unwilling. They're not unwilling. They just dislike it, right?
Yep. No, they reluctantly, they're willing to begrudgingly do this.
Yeah. All right, almost 1.5 hours in. I think, should we do like a general review of the book?
Yeah, we can just do a little point on the meaning of democracy there, because he does go into trying to distinguish between, the formal concept of democracy as the sovereign citizen, basically, that everybody's going to be heard and have a voice within the decisions that are being made. And he says that, like, okay, this is trash, but democracy in the sense of having rights, right? You have the rule of law and you have rights, which means that you're insulated from the kind of completely arbitrary whims of some sovereign authority, right? That there is some balance of power in your society that can ensure that you have some rights and that you're not completely at the mercy of like a dictator, an emperor or something. And he does make the point that there are, objective differences, at least in his view, between, let's say, like the United Kingdom or the United States and China, for example, or some of these Eastern places where people are a lot more at the mercy of the dictatorial powers or the monarchies than we would be here. And this is where, like, we talked about, like, how exactly is Burnham conservative. Like, this is really the core of like why he founded like the National Review. It's really, he tries to protect democracy in the sense that you need to protect the rule of law and the idea that you can have certain rights that are being maintained and that you have like a balance of power in society in order to maintain those rights, so that all power is not consolidated. And you're even though things are moving a little bit slower, like, people are not completely at the whims of arbitrary power. So that's what he believes in. He believes in that, and like his the previous update on science, basically, that's kind of like Burnham's thing, the two things that he actually cares about. So yeah, I don't know if you have anything more to add, but like, what's your view on the review on the book?
Well, I think we've sort of scattered it throughout the discussion here, but I want to reiterate that this is a very good book to get a very good overview of a lot of historical right-wing thinkers. So just for that, it's worth a read. I'm not very sold on Burnham's own musings on sort of what can and will be done, but I will sort of forgive him for not knowing, for not being able to see the future, right? From his point of view, I think a lot of it makes sense because he's living in 1940s America, where the rule of law is still a thing, whereas a lot of places in America it seems like it isn't today. So he's conservative, yes, in that sense, but I think it's just sort of like a quirk of history that he has become more conservative, as the years have gone on. I don't think he was as conservative.
Yeah, I mean, I think
when he published this,
he did have a sort of instinctual contempt for shitlibs. I don't remember exactly the book. There's some book or some article that he wrote about like liberals in the 1960s and their relation to minority groups and so on. I wish I remembered it, but it's like he I mean, in the sense of being based in that piece, he comes off as based as like it's possible. Basically, he sort of predicted.
I think what I'm missing from Burnham is that he's very technocratically, conservative. He's very, very good at analyzing these systems, explaining or putting together explanations of how they work and presenting that in a good way. But he lacks any sort of, and I think that's intentional because of his scientific sort of approach to this. As someone like Evola, who has a lot deeper historical, spiritual mindset, I wouldn't hesitate for a second to say that someone like Evola is more right wing than James Burnham. Right? Now I know the joke is that Evola is right wing of everyone, but Burnham looks like an absolute leftist compared to him. Right.
Yeah, he does, but I mean, he still has masculinity. I think if you talk about like residues, right, the sort of underlying instinctual impulses. I think he has some of the right-wing impulses, even though some of the
Certainly,
implementations and the ideas that they have
Yeah.
are kind of outdated compared to 50 years later or whatever. But
Exactly.
you can't fault him for
That's
that.
what I'm
I think,
saying. I'm not
know,
going to fault him for not being able to see the future, right? He's it's a very competent book. It is a very good book. It paints a very clear picture of how society works, and I would recommend everyone listening to read it.
yeah,
That's
and it's
my
not too long
that's my
either.
final. No, it's like
I
250 pages or something. They're not
Yeah.
that big either. I have like a pocket edition, so not
yeah, I know
not
for
too
me that
expensive,
if
not too long, not too complicated, not too dense, not like weird translated Italian. Like if you're trying to read The Prince, now I know Nordan he corrected me earlier saying that The Prince isn't that long, no, but it's still written in a weird way because of the translations. So again, kind of like the Populist Delusion, this is a very logical next step if you're sort of if you want to either don't know where to start or you don't feel like you have the time to dive like really deep into mind and society, right?
yeah, no, that's all good. Should we take some audience questions before we round off?
If there's any questions or comments from the audience before we leave, that's fine. We can just muse on the Nord Stream stuff for a moment while we wait, which is a large article written by Seymour Hersh, the journalist, an old school guy who is detailing, according to public and some non-public sources, how the Americans and the Norwegians conspired together to implement a remote detonated explosive on the Nord Stream pipeline, which then was detonated. How long ago? Remember?
No, I don't.
I don't remember the date, but basically it confirms what a lot of people in our spaces were saying, that this is probably the Americans. I don't think if we ever said it, but I have had conversations with friends and family about whether or not the Norwegians were involved, especially after the episode where the prime minister was supposed to share information about this, and there were American military guarding the press conference. My radar pretty much went off to, one, dispelling any notion that we are a sovereign nation, and two, that we might have had something to do with this, at least provided intel or help, right? Or at least, or if nothing else, sort of the launching point for the operation. Considering that we are NATO allies and we're close, but this is something that Hersh goes into quite a bit of detail in the article. It has one very cool line that I want to highlight in regards to our former prime minister and leader of NATO, Jens Stoltenberg. And this is just a straight out, I'm just going to read the paragraph. Norway was one of the original signatories of the NATO treaty in 1949, in the early days of the Cold War. Today, the supreme commander of NATO is Jens Stoltenberg, a committed anti-communist who served as Norway's prime minister for 8 years before moving to his high NATO post with American backing in 2014. He was a hardliner on all things Putin and Russia, who had cooperated with the American intelligence community ever since the Vietnam War. He has been trusted completely ever since. Quote, "He is the glove that fits the American hand," the source said. Which I think is the nicest way to say that
I thought about
another
metaphor. Thought about another metaphor there, but we're not gonna go there. It's a family show.
No, it's a family show. All right, there doesn't seem to be any. You've written in a weird way. Do you mean Italian? Yes. Yes. Well, written in a weird way in that it's very often translated to older versions of English as well. So there's like multiple versions of it's not just Old English, it might be Old Italian, right? So someone like Machiavelli is writing in Old Italian, and then that gets translated to an older version of English, right? Which then gets updated. And so what you end up with is sentence structures and things like that, which for someone who isn't necessarily a native English speaker might be a bit difficult. I'm not saying it's like super hard to read The Prince. I'm just saying that it might be harder than you think.
But even if you can see the point that The Prince is not that daunting, I mean, it's nice to have somebody compile, let's say, Mind and Society, or some of the work of like Michel's, or
Yeah.
some of these other thinkers that are much more impenetrable and have like libraries of worth of work. Just to have like their stuff parsed out in a couple of chapters is quite handy.
Yeah, no, I'm not saying I can't read it. I'm just saying, and why do I have to explain this? I'm just saying that reading Ye Olde English is harder than reading the English that I was taught growing up, right? Which shouldn't be very difficult to understand. So someone might want to forgo that and just, get the highlights from someone like James Burnham instead. But if you're, very interested, then of course go read The Prince, go read Mind and Society, go read Revolt Against the Modern World, by all means. I mean, they're great books. Well, I can only speak for like 1.5 of them. Question from Chris Bronson. Will the official media keep these Nord Stream revelations from reaching the broader public, especially in Germany? I think that it doesn't matter. Which sounds kind of silly. I think that they're going to deny it, which they already have, I think. Because if they admit it, then Germany will, have reasons to be angry and claim reparations or whatever, right? Russia will have maybe an act of war to reference in the UN Security Council. It's going to be one of those things where everyone's just going to deny it, and everyone's going to know that the US did it. Because if the US or the Norwegians say that they did it, it's going to be a bigger headache for everyone involved.
It's a bit tricky to sell people on the political formula, if if you're just going to go out and straight out admit that this is what happened, then but we're not going to do anything. So just notice and move along, people.
It's not going to be the first time that the US has done something shady, and then like sometime later we find out that they were the one who did that massacre or something. Well, part and parcel of being part of an empire.
It's the $1 Million Extreme, like sort of Sam Hyde sketch. You tripped my wife. That's like the United States, where you Nick Rochford basically is like just smashed glass into your wife's face and like, you just tripped my wife.
Did you just trick my wife? Sick, dude. It's not about not being arsed. I'm just saying this is an option, right? If you find that difficult, if you don't have the time to read the source material of something like Mind and Society, this is a very good inclusion or place to start. And by all means, if you read the Machiavellians and figure out that, what, I really like that Pareto chapter, go read Mind and Society. And I hate this idea that, this is not to attack Nordanon or anything. This is just a side point that, you have to like autistically read books. Just, if I just read 150 books this year, I'm going to automatically just get big brained. If I just, that was
you're being gatekept out of your own sphere at this point.
I'm being gatekept.
we have to shut it
show.
down.
No, I mean like this year I'm gonna read like Sapiens, and I'm gonna read like, here's all of my books for this year, and I'm gonna read one book a week no matter what, instead of just do the journey for your own sake, right? Do the intellectual journey for your own sake. If it takes you like 4 months to read a book, well, then it took you 4 months to read a book. But if you totally understand what the author was trying to say and you have internalized it, I mean, that's worth a lot more than just speeding through something just because, right?
Yeah, I mean, not everybody can be Lex Friedman, right, and just have a job and read the Brothers Karamazov in 5 days or whatever. So,
well, and even though
that's,
in theory, like, okay, I can sit down and read, something, just for the sake of it, right? Just because I want to, I have to read like as many books as possible. But I know for a fact that if I do that, I'll skip stuff in the sense that I'll not internalize the points. So what's the point then, right?
well, yeah, I mean, if you learned anything from this stream, I mean, specialization is a fact, right? I mean, not everybody's going to be literary critics and spend your entire time reading. You don't have time for anything else. So there is a lot of use in these kind of compendium books, so the people who can summarize it into concise point that you could spend less time reading. Not saying you shouldn't read, but I mean, of course, if you're going to read everything, then that's all you're going to do, and I don't know how useful that is either. Whether it's politically or
Well, you can be a
like for you
scholar, but
personally.
I'm not a scholar.
Yeah.
So I'm not an academic in the sense that it's my job to read stuff and write stuff, right? Someone like
We
Lex
just want to
Friedman,
be,
right?
yeah, we just want to be
It's-
generally educated. We don't have 200 IQs.
I'm just a programmer
yeah.
who couldn't stop noticing, okay? And I'm just trying to survive. And if that means I have to read Mind and Society, that means I'm going to read Mind and Society, but I'm going to start with this one with James Burnham, and then I'm going to see where it takes me, right? All right, I think that's you've riled me up. Now it's time to go home.
Yeah, you won't be able to. You won't be able to sleep now. You'll just be
I'm gonna
laying in your bed,
seethe all
just
night
seething in the dark. Yeah,
Yeah.
fucking Nordanon.
All right. Thank you everyone for watching. We'll be back next week with more content for the sensible centrist. Until then, have a good weekend and we'll see you then.